She buried her mother alive for inheritance. Years later, a door opened during a job interview, one she never wanted to see again. Her triumph was only the beginning of her downfall. Subscribe and activate the bell. The Victorian mansion on Elm Street in Greenwich, Connecticut, stood like a monument to old money and older secrets. Its pristine white columns and meticulously manicured gardens concealing decades of family dysfunction that had festered behind closed doors like an untreated infection. Emily Carter, 32 years old with weary eyes that reflected years of accumulated disappointments and calloused hands from working far beneath her intellectual capabilities, sat across from her mother, Margaret Foster, at the mahogany dining table that had witnessed 3 generations of psychological warfare disguised as family dinners. Margaret, 68 and sharp as a freshly honed blade despite her perfectly arranged silver hair, had just delivered the words that would shatter everything Emily thought she understood about family loyalty, inheritance rights, and her place in the world. She was changing her will to favor Jennifer exclusively, leaving Emily with barely enough to cover funeral expenses when the inevitable day arrived. This wasn't merely about money, though the $8 million estate represented security beyond most people's wildest dreams. It was about power, about control, about proving that even in death, Margaret would determine who mattered in the Foster family hierarchy and who remained invisible, forgotten, worthless in the grand scheme of things. Emily's hands trembled uncontrollably as she set down her delicate porcelain coffee cup, the sound against the matching saucer echoing through the dining room like breaking bones in the suffocating silence that had descended upon them. The irony wasn't lost on her that this life-altering conversation was taking place in the same elegant room where, as a hopeful child, she had dreamed of family dinners filled with warmth and laughter, where she had imagined grown-up conversations about her future, achievements, and the doors that her mother's wealth and social connections could help her open. But how could anyone anticipate what desperation might drive a human being to do when pushed beyond all reasonable limits and stripped of hope? Emily had spent 3 decades watching her younger sister Jennifer glide effortlessly through life on wings of maternal approval, while Emily herself worked crushing 60-hour weeks at Morrison & Associates, a mid-tier accounting firm that deliberately underpaid her, a direct result of Margaret's quiet but devastating sabotage among their wealthy social circle. The unfairness had fermented in Emily's chest for years, transforming from mere hurt to bitter resentment to something infinitely more dangerous. She had watched Jennifer receive the finest education money could buy while Emily was encouraged to settle for less. She had watched Jennifer's failed business ventures receive immediate financial bailouts while Emily's modest requests for help were met with lectures about fiscal responsibility and learning life's hard lessons. 2 weeks later, on a moonless Tuesday night in October when the autumn wind rattled the mansion's ancient windows, Emily stood in the basement that smelled of old wine and older secrets, staring at a reinforced wooden coffin she had ordered online under the pretense of Halloween office decorations. Her mother lay unconscious inside the box, heavily sedated with prescription medication Emily had systematically stolen from 3 different pharmacies across Westchester County, timing her visits carefully to avoid suspicion and always paying in cash to prevent any digital trail that might later implicate her. The plan, as Emily had rationalized it in her increasingly fragmented and desperate mind, wasn't supposed to be permanent, just long enough to teach Margaret a lesson about cruelty, about what it truly felt like to be powerless and dismissed. But intentions, as Emily would learn in the most devastating way possible, mean absolutely nothing when weighed against horrific consequences. The 17 days that followed were a descent into hell that no human being should ever endure, and no daughter should ever inflict upon the woman who gave her life, regardless of whatever grievances or psychological wounds might exist between them. Emily visited the basement twice daily with the mechanical precision of someone performing a religious ritual, methodically lowering bottles of water and protein bars into the makeshift tomb where Margaret Foster, a woman who had once dominated charity boards and social committees with iron-fisted authority and commanded respect and fear in equal measure from Connecticut's social elite, now, existed in a space smaller than most prison cells, smaller than the walk-in closet in the master bedroom where she had once held court over the family's daily emotional dramas. Margaret's eyes, when Emily lifted the heavy wooden lid with hands that shook more violently with each passing day, held a terror so pure and absolute it seemed to burn the very air between mother and daughter, creating an atmosphere so thick with fear and guilt that Emily could barely breathe during these twice-daily confrontations with the magnitude of what she had set in motion. There was no recognition in those eyes anymore, not of Emily as her daughter, not of the basement as the familiar space where Margaret had once stored her prized wine collection, not even of herself as the Margaret Foster who had ruled Greenwich society with calculated precision for decades. What kind of monster, systematically, checks on their victim like a prison guard maintaining surveillance? What kind of daughter ensures their mother has just barely enough water and sustenance to survive another day of complete darkness while maintaining the pretense of normal life in the rooms directly? Above this ongoing torture, Emily asked herself these questions during every sleepless night, lying in her childhood bed and staring at ceiling stars that still glowed faintly from her 8th birthday, listening to the old house settle around, her like the bones of something slowly dying from within. She told herself repeatedly that it would end soon, that Margaret would finally understand. The lesson Emily was desperately trying to teach would promise to restore Emily's rightful inheritance, would at last acknowledge her elder daughter's worth and humanity and fundamental right to exist as more than a disappointment. But wounded pride, once it takes root in a human heart and begins to metastasize, becomes something alive and hungry that feeds voraciously on justification and revenge, growing stronger with each feeding until it consumes everything else that might once have resembled conscience or compassion. The private investigator Jennifer had hired with cold, calculating precision captured absolutely everything on high-definition camera equipment that cost more than most people earned in an entire year. 28-year-old Jennifer, beautiful in the classical way that opened doors and hearts with equal ease, possessed a ruthless intelligence that Emily had consistently underestimated despite years of observation and competition. Jennifer had noticed the subtle but telling changes in her sister's behavior with the sharp instincts of a natural predator who had learned to read weakness and vulnerability with surgical precision, the poorly disguised relief masquerading as grief whenever neighbors or family friends mentioned Margaret's mysterious absence. The obsessive attention to the basement that had never interested Emily during all her previous years living in the house. The nervous energy that radiated from Emily like heat from a raging fever, making her jump at unexpected sounds and flinch away from casual physical contact as if her skin had become hypersensitive to human touch. Jennifer possessed cunning intelligence combined with an intuitive understanding of human psychology. She correctly calculated that her comfortable future depended entirely on Emily never inheriting a single dollar of their mother's considerable estate. When Margaret's heart finally gave out on day 17, not from suffocation or dehydration, but from the pure, overwhelming terror of prolonged confinement that triggered a massive cardiac event, Emily's brief, emotional collapse was recorded in devastating high definition that would later be analyzed frame by criminal psychologists and horrified juries. That footage would transform Emily Carter from a specific individual with complex personal history into a universal symbol of human depravity that criminal psychology textbooks would reference for decades, as an example of how supposedly normal people could descend into acts of cruelty that defied rational explanation. The trial became a media circus that transformed the quiet, prestigious town of Greenwich into a macabre carnival of horror tourism, drawing visitors from across the country and international news crews who recognized that this case represented something uniquely disturbing about American family dysfunction and the dark underbelly of suburban privilege. Reporters established semi-permanent camps outside the courthouse, their satellite trucks and broadcast equipment turning the normally sedate government district into something resembling a war zone, while vendors appeared as if by magic to hawk T-shirts featuring Emily's mugshot, alongside sensationalist slogans that reduced human tragedy to profitable. Merchandised legal experts dissected every aspect of Emily's deteriorating psychology on cable news, programs that ran 24 hours a day, bringing in retired FBI profilers, criminal psychologists, and forensic psychiatrists to analyze her motivations, her methods, and her apparent transformation from privileged daughter to methodical killer. Emily, handcuffed and wearing an orange jumpsuit that made her pale skin appear almost ghostly under harsh courtroom lighting, sat motionless throughout the proceedings as prosecutors methodically painted her as a calculating monster whose insatiable greed had overcome every natural instinct of filial love and basic human decency. Her court-appointed attorney, David Brennan, struggled heroically but futilely to mount any coherent defense against evidence that seemed to speak for itself with devastating clarity. His arguments about years of emotional abuse and systematic favoritism fell on deaf ears when contrasted with video footage of Emily methodically checking on her dying mother twice daily while maintaining the facade of normal life above ground. How could any jury sympathize with someone who had demonstrated such calculated cruelty over such an extended period? Jennifer's testimony provided the emotional crescendo that sealed Emily's fate in the minds of both jury and public opinion. Her performance on the witness stand was a masterpiece of calculated theatrical grief that would have impressed professional actors with its subtle authenticity and devastating emotional impact. Dressed in conservative black clothing that emphasized her youth and vulnerability, tears streaming down her perfectly composed face at precisely the right moments. She described Emily as perpetually jealous, consistently manipulative, and capable of shocking violence when denied what she considered her due. "She would hurt our family pets when she was angry at Mother," Jennifer sobbed into the courtroom microphone, her voice breaking with apparent anguish as she recalled specific incidents from their privileged childhood. "She once told me she wished our mother would just disappear forever, that she fantasized about what it would be like if Margaret stopped existing and left everything to us. I never imagined she meant it literally. I never thought she would actually—" Jennifer's voice trailed off into sobs that echoed through the courtroom and into millions of homes where people watched these proceedings unfold on television. None of Jennifer's testimony was technically false. Emily had, indeed, been angry frequently, had made cruel comments during moments of rage and frustration, had occasionally demonstrated the kind of casual cruelty toward animals that suggested deeper psychological problems. But Jennifer's carefully chosen words and expertly timed emotional displays painted a picture of lifelong violent tendencies and deliberate premeditation that the horrified jury found impossible to dismiss or contextualize within the broader pattern of family dysfunction that had created this tragedy. The sentence was 25 years for aggravated homicide with special circumstances, a verdict that surprised absolutely no one who had followed the trial's progression through weeks of damning evidence. But Emily's real punishment had begun long before any judge pronounced her fate or any jury deliberated her guilt. Her face had become internationally synonymous with matricide, appearing on true crime documentaries with sensationalist titles like The Daughter Who Buried, Love Alive, and Connecticut's Monster When Family Bonds Turned Deadly. Media platforms transformed her into a cautionary tale about the darkest possibilities of feminine evil, with her mugshot becoming an internet meme that represented the ultimate violation of family bonds and maternal relationships. Former friends systematically burned photographs and deleted contact information, treating Emily as if she had been infected with some contagious moral disease that might spread to them through association. As the prison transport van pulled slowly away from the courthouse steps, Emily caught one final glimpse of Jennifer standing in the crowd of reporters and curiosity seekers who had gathered to witness this concluding chapter of her public destruction. Her younger sister wasn't crying anymore. The performance was over. The cameras had captured what they needed. Instead, she was calmly checking her smartphone, probably scheduling appointments with estate attorneys to handle the transfer of their mother's considerable fortune. or perhaps coordinating with interior designers who would help her renovate the family mansion to erase any trace of Emily's existence. In that crystalline moment of absolute clarity, Emily understood with devastating completeness that she had been systematically manipulated and played from the very beginning of this family tragedy. Jennifer hadn't simply inherited $8 million through the fortunate circumstances of being their mother's favored child. She had deliberately orchestrated the perfect crime by encouraging Emily's desperation while positioning herself as the innocent victim who deserved everything their mother had to leave behind. Danbury Federal Penitentiary became Emily's entire universe for what would be the next 25 years of her existence, a world so completely divorced from everything she had previously known that it might as well have been located on another planet orbiting a different sun. The woman who had grown up sleeping on Egyptian cotton sheets in a climate-controlled bedroom now lay on thin, uncomfortable mattresses over cold metal frames, sharing cramped 9-square-meter cells with other women who knew her horrific story in complete detail, thanks to the exhaustive media coverage that had made her face recognizable to anyone who owned a television. In the rigid hierarchy that governs prison life with the inflexibility of natural law, there exist unwritten but absolutely enforced rules about which crimes earn grudging respect from fellow inmates and which earn nothing but pure contempt and social isolation. Drug dealers might be admired for their entrepreneurial skills and street wisdom, armed robbers respected for their courage in confronting danger. Even some murderers granted understanding if their victims had been abusive partners or child, predators who arguably deserved their fate. But systematically torturing one's own mother over 17 days of calculated cruelty placed Emily at the absolute bottom of the social structure, lower than any other category of criminal, viewed as someone who had violated the most fundamental taboo of human civilization. The first 6 months of Emily's incarceration were characterized by complete social isolation that proved more psychologically devastating than any physical punishment could have been. No fellow inmates spoke to her during communal meals, conversations stopping abruptly when she approached tables and resuming only after she had moved beyond hearing range. During daily exercise periods in the concrete yard, Emily walked endless solitary circuits while groups of other women formed purposefully away from her contaminating presence, treating her as if she carried some infectious moral disease that might spread through casual contact. During mandatory collective showers, other inmates systematically turned their backs, creating invisible but impenetrable walls of rejection that somehow proved more psychologically painful than outright violence would have been. At least, violence would have acknowledged her existence as a human being worthy of hatred. This systematic erasure treated her as something less than human, unworthy even of the energy required for active hostility. While Emily withered away behind concrete walls and razor wire, becoming a shadow of her former self, Jennifer flourished in ways that seemed almost supernatural in their speed and completeness. The younger sister, now sole heir to the substantial foster family fortune, transformed herself with remarkable efficiency into Connecticut high society's newest darling, moving through exclusive social circles with the confidence of someone who had always belonged but now possessed the financial resources to claim her rightful place at the center of everything that mattered in their insular world. Jennifer renovated the Victorian mansion with systematic thoroughness, erasing any trace of Emily's existence with the efficiency of someone editing history itself. Emily's childhood bedroom became a home office decorated in soft pastels that suggested feminine productivity rather than the darker emotions that had once festered in that space. Family photographs that had lined hallways for generations were carefully edited and replaced with versions showing only Jennifer at various stages of development. The basement where Margaret had died in terror became simply a wine cellar again, restored to its original purpose with meticulous attention that ensured no physical evidence remained of the unimaginable horror that had unfolded during those 17 days and nights. Jennifer hired contractors who specialized in historical restoration, paying premium prices to ensure every stone was properly cleaned every wooden beam refinished to perfection, every bottle replaced according to Margaret's detailed inventory. Jennifer's marriage to Bradley Whitman, a prestigious corporate lawyer from Old Boston Money, was featured in society magazines with 6-page spreads that captured every detail of what writers described as the wedding of the decade. The couple appeared radiant against the mansion's backdrop, Jennifer's custom Paris wedding dress flowing like liquid pearl across the same lawns where Emily had once played as a child, dreaming of her own future wedding. In carefully orchestrated interviews with lifestyle journalists, Jennifer spoke with practiced sorrow about what she tactfully called our family tragedy, positioning herself as the courageous survivor who had chosen to honor their mother's memory through philanthropic work rather than retreating into bitterness or despair. Most tellingly, Jennifer never mentioned Emily by name, referring only to the person responsible, as if her sister had been erased from existence entirely. Emily's third year in prison brought her absolute darkest moment, when her will to continue existing nearly shattered under the accumulated weight of isolation, guilt, and gradual realization that she had destroyed her entire life for nothing more substantial than a moment of desperate revenge. She had developed mechanical survival routines designed to minimize conscious thought, wake at dawn, work 8 hours in the prison laundry, return to her cell for processed food dinner, attempt sleep while listening, to hundreds of other damaged women coping with their own forms of desperation, but even carefully constructed routines couldn't protect her from memories that invaded during vulnerable moments, usually in the gray twilight between waking and sleeping when psychological defenses were weakest. One March evening, lying motionless while cellmates snored nearby, Emily remembered a specific Christmas when she was 8 years old and Margaret had promised they would make cookies together, a rare moment of potential maternal bonding that had filled young Emily with desperate hope. But Margaret had spent that day managing charity committee, business over the telephone, and when Emily tried starting the project independently, she was harshly scolded for making unnecessary mess. That seemingly insignificant memory triggered something catastrophic in Emily's psyche. She realized with brutal clarity that she had spent 32 years seeking approval from someone incapable of providing it, transforming herself into something infinitely more monstrous than Margaret ever was. At 2:17 a.m., Emily made a noose from carefully torn bedsheets and climbed onto her metal bed frame. Her mind felt strangely calm. The world would be measurably better without her existence. But Rhonda Martinez, her cellmate, had been watching Emily's behavior with the attention of someone who recognized warning signs. When Rhonda saw Emily with the improvised noose, she screamed with desperate force, bringing guards running who cut Emily down before she could complete her final act. Emily was placed in suicide watch, complete isolation in a specially designed cell with 24-hour surveillance, nothing but a mattress and anti-suicide blanket. For 72 hours, she existed in complete sensory deprivation that pushed human endurance beyond normal limits. In that hollow space, forced to confront every toxic thought without distraction, something fundamental began shifting in her damaged psyche. It wasn't sudden religious awakening. It was subtle recognition that even at absolute despair, when she had decided life held no value, her heart continued beating with steady determination. Her lungs kept drawing breath automatically. Some primitive part fought for survival when she consciously wanted death, suggesting perhaps deep biological wisdom understood something about existence that her guilt-ridden mind had lost sight of completely. Dr. Raymond Walsh was 63 years old, with disheveled gray hair that suggested he spent more time thinking about other people's psychological problems than maintaining his own appearance, and eyes that reflected decades of witnessing the absolute worst aspects of human nature, without losing his essential compassion or fundamental belief in the possibility of redemption even for those who seemed irredeemably lost. He had worked as Danbury's head psychiatrist for 18 years after retiring from a distinguished but emotionally draining career in forensic psychiatric hospitals, and unlike every other mental health professional Emily had encountered since her arrest and conviction, Raymond displayed no visible shock, disgust, or moral judgment when he opened her thick file for the first time and read about the crime that had brought her to his professional attention. He simply pulled up a standard-issue metal folding chair in the small, windowless therapy room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and decades of accumulated human suffering, sat down directly across from her with the relaxed posture of someone who was genuinely comfortable in his own skin despite the challenging nature of his work, and said in a calm, steady voice that carried no trace of condemnation, superiority, or the kind of morbid fascination she had grown accustomed to seeing in people who learned about her case. "So, Emily Carter, let's talk about why you're still alive when you clearly don't want to be, and what we might be able to do about that particular situation." The first several therapy sessions consisted primarily of Emily's stubborn, determined silence and Raymond's patient professional waiting. She refused to speak, keeping her eyes fixed with laser focus on the gray concrete floor while he sat quietly nearby, occasionally reading aloud from books she couldn't see but whose contents seemed carefully selected for their relevance to her psychological state and potential for beginning some form of healing process. His voice was steady and oddly hypnotic, with the kind of measured cadence that suggested years of practice in talking to people who didn't want to be talked to, and despite her fierce determination to remain emotionally disconnected from everyone and everything around her, Emily found herself listening almost against her conscious will. His reading selections weren't the typical self-help platitudes or religious texts she might have expected from a prison psychiatrist trying to rehabilitate hardened criminals. Instead, he read passages from Viktor Frankl's profound meditations on finding meaning in the midst of unimaginable suffering, excerpts from letters written by political prisoners who had survived decades of brutal incarceration by maintaining rigorous mental discipline and unwavering sense of purpose, philosophical reflections on the nature of redemption and personal transformation from thinkers who had confronted their own capacity for evil and found ways to transcend it without denying its reality or minimizing its impact on themselves and others. There was something profoundly different about Raymond's presence in that sterile, institutional environment. He seemed genuinely uninterested in judging her or extracting confessions or demonstrations of remorse that might satisfy some abstract notion of justice or rehabilitation requirements. He appeared to be operating from some deeper understanding of human psychology that transcended simple categories of good and evil, guilty and innocent, redeemable and irredeemably lost, as if he had spent decades studying the full spectrum of human behavior and had arrived at conclusions that were more complex and nuanced than the black and white moral frameworks that most people use to navigate their understanding of crime and punishment. "Why do you waste your valuable time with someone like me?" Emily finally asked during their fifth session, her voice hoarse and unfamiliar from weeks of deliberate disuse, the words emerging with difficulty as if her vocal cords had forgotten their basic function after months of refusing to engage in any form of meaningful human communication. "You've read my file cover to cover. You know exactly what kind of person I am and what I'm capable of doing to people I claim to love, most in the world." Raymond carefully closed the book he had been reading. She could see now that it was a collection of essays about moral philosophy and the nature of human evil, and looked directly at her with eyes that held no trace of judgment, disgust, or the kind of morbid fascination she had grown accustomed to seeing in people who learned about her crime and wanted to understand how someone could descend to such depths of cruelty. Instead, his expression conveyed only professional curiosity mixed with something that might have been genuine human interest in her well-being. As if she were a complex puzzle he was genuinely invested in solving not for his own intellectual satisfaction, but for her ultimate benefit and potential. "Recovery. I know what kind of act you committed under very specific circumstances that we're still trying to understand," he responded with the same calm, measured tone he had maintained throughout all their previous sessions, his voice carrying no hint of condescension or moral superiority that might have triggered her defensive mechanisms. But I don't actually know what kind of person you are, and more importantly for our work together, you don't know either. The person who made the decision to imprison her mother in that basement was constructed by 32 years of particular experiences, psychological conditioning, family dynamics, and environmental factors that created a perfect storm of desperation and moral blindness. That deceptively simple question hung in the stale air of the therapy room like a challenge that would ultimately define the next 2 decades of Emily's existence, transforming her understanding of identity, responsibility, and the possibility of redemption from abstract philosophical concepts into practical, daily choices that would determine whether her remaining years would be spent in continued psychological torment or in some form of constructive growth and meaningful contribution to the world around her, however limited that world might be within the confines of federal prison. Raymond worked with methodical patience and professional skill to rebuild her completely shattered psychological foundation, but his approach was unlike anything she had anticipated based on her previous experiences with mental health professionals who had treated her more as a fascinating case study than as a human being deserving of genuine care and therapeutic attention. He didn't minimize or excuse her crime. Instead, he forced her to confront it with brutal completeness, to acknowledge the absolute monstrosity of her actions without allowing paralyzing guilt to prevent forward movement toward some form of constructive existence that might have meaning beyond mere survival. Guilt is completely useless if it doesn't lead to genuine change and meaningful action, he repeated constantly throughout their sessions, his voice taking on the quality of a therapeutic mantra that was designed to reprogram her fundamental understanding of remorse and responsibility. You cannot undo what you did to your mother. That 17 days of suffering you inflicted is a permanent part of reality now, carved into the historical record and into the memories of everyone who knew her. No amount of self-hatred or psychological self-flagellation will change that fact or somehow balance the cosmic scales of justice. But you can decide what that terrible act means for the rest of your existence, whether it defines you completely or becomes the catalyst for a transformation that creates some form of meaning from meaningless suffering. Raymond introduced Emily to educational programs within the prison system that she had completely ignored during her first 3 years of numbed mechanical survival, programs that had been designed specifically to help inmates develop practical skills that might help them reintegrate into society upon release rather than simply marking time until their sentences were completed. He personally enrolled her in business administration courses offered through partnerships with local community colleges, despite her initial protests that education was pointless for someone who would spend the next 22 years in a cage and would emerge at age 57, with a criminal record that would make employment impossible in any legitimate profession. You have a genuinely sharp, analytical mind that's being completely wasted in this environment, he explained with the kind of directness that Emily found both challenging and oddly comforting after years of being treated as a pariah worthy only of contempt and fear. Use it constructively, not to escape from reality or to distract yourself from the magnitude of what you've done, but to build practical skills that will have real value when you're eventually released back into society. The world you return to will be different from the one you left, but human beings will still need people who can solve complex problems, analyze financial systems, and help organizations operate more efficiently and ethically. More crucially for Emily's long-term psychological recovery, Raymond began sharing carefully selected details of his own personal story of loss and guilt, opening windows into his own experience of moral complexity that helped Emily understand that even mental health professionals struggled with questions of responsibility, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption after devastating failures that had cost innocent lives. He talked about his younger brother Alex, who had committed suicide at 19 after struggling with undiagnosed schizophrenia and receiving inadequate mental health support from their family and community, despite Raymond's advanced training in psychology and his theoretical understanding of mental illness. Warning signs. Raymond, had spent years drowning in self-recrimination, for not recognizing the symptoms that seemed obvious in retrospect, for not intervening more aggressively when Alex began showing clear signs of psychotic episodes, for failing his brother when Alex needed him most desperately, and when Raymond's professional expertise should have made him the one person capable of providing effective help and preventing the tragedy that ultimately claimed Alex's life and haunted Raymond's career for decades afterward. The parallel between Raymond's guilt over failing to save his brother and Emily's guilt over actively destroying her mother wasn't lost on either of them, though Raymond was careful to maintain appropriate therapeutic boundaries while still offering the kind of authentic human connection that Emily had been starved of for years. His willingness to share his own experiences of moral failure and psychological recovery provided Emily with her first glimpse of what genuine healing might look like, not the erasure of guilt or the minimization of harm caused, but the transformation of destructive emotions into constructive action. I buried myself completely in work with mentally ill criminals because I thought I could somehow compensate for failing Alex, Raymond admitted during one particularly intense and honest session that marked a turning point in their therapeutic relationship and Emily's understanding of what recovery might actually mean in practical terms. But eventually I realized I was just perpetuating my own psychological prison of guilt and regret, using my patient's problems as a way to avoid confronting my own feelings of inadequacy and moral failure. Real healing and genuine change only became possible when I stopped trying unsuccessfully to save everyone around me and started focusing on being genuinely present and helpful for the specific people I could actually reach. These conversations planted something powerful and unexpected in Emily's damaged psyche, not hope exactly, because hope seemed too fragile and naive for someone in her position, too easily crushed by the daily realities of prison life and the knowledge that society would never truly forgive her crimes, but something more substantial and enduring: determination. If she truly had to spend the next 22 years of her life in this concrete and steel environment, surrounded by women who despised her and guards who viewed her as less than human, she would not waste that time existing as an empty ghost of her former self, drifting through meaningless routines while her mind deteriorated from lack of stimulation and purpose. The transformation that followed was systematic, relentless, and ultimately as profound as any religious conversion or spiritual awakening, though it was grounded in practical action rather than mystical experience. Emily approached her prison education with the focused intensity of a medical student preparing for life-or-death surgery, understanding that her intellectual development during incarceration might be the only thing that could save her from complete psychological destruction, or prepare her for any kind of meaningful existence upon eventual release. She completed not one, but 3 separate associate degrees through rigorous distance learning programs that required her to maintain correspondence with professors she would never meet, submit assignments through a complex bureaucratic system that often delayed feedback for weeks, and take proctored examinations under conditions that would have challenged even students who weren't dealing with the stress of prison life and social isolation. Her areas of study, business administration, finance, and information systems, were chosen strategically rather than based on personal interest, selected because they represented fields where practical skills might translate into employment opportunities, even for someone with her background and the permanent stigma of her crime. Her daily routine became almost monastic in its disciplined precision, structured around the understanding that every hour spent productively was an hour stolen back from despair and self-destruction. Emily also began observing the prison's complex informal economy with the careful attention of a professional anthropologist studying tribal behavior, recognizing that understanding power dynamics, resource allocation, and social networks would be crucial skills regardless of the environment where she eventually found herself. She noticed how real power flowed through the cell blocks versus apparent authority structures, who held genuine influence among the inmates versus those who simply made the most noise and attracted the most attention from guards and administrators. She gradually began offering basic accounting and financial literacy services to other inmates, helping them organize their extremely limited personal finances, assisting with budgeting for eventual release, teaching fundamental principles of money management that many had never learned despite years of involvement in various illegal enterprises that had brought them to prison in the first place. This practical helpfulness slowly began to shift her reputation within the prison community in ways that she had never anticipated, but that proved psychologically crucial for her continued development. She evolved from simply being the woman who buried her mother alive, a designation that had isolated her completely and made her a target for both verbal abuse and potential violence, to becoming Carter, the one who actually understands numbers and can help you figure out your money situation when you get out. It was a subtle but significant change that gave Emily her first taste in years of what it might feel like to be valued for her contributions rather than defined entirely by her worst moment, to be seen as someone with useful skills rather than just as a symbol of human evil that needed to be avoided and contained. Raymond remained her most important mentor and guide throughout this process, but his approach deepened and became more sophisticated as the years accumulated, and Emily demonstrated genuine commitment to transformation, rather than merely serving time until release. Professor Marcus Chen from NYU's prestigious business school began corresponding with Emily during her 15th year of imprisonment through the prison's volunteer mentorship program, a relationship that would prove crucial for her eventual professional development and successful reintegration into competitive business environments that had no patience for sob stories or excuses about difficult pasts. An accomplished academic who donated significant amounts of his personal time to advising incarcerated individuals, Marcus immediately recognized something extraordinary in Emily's carefully written letters: brutal intelligence combined with utterly unwavering motivation, forged in circumstances that would have completely destroyed most people's sanity and will to continue existing. He guided her through increasingly complex case studies of corporate recoveries, hostile takeovers, and complete business restructurings following major scandals or failures that had seemed to permanently destroy companies' reputations and market positions. These exercises weren't merely academic. They were practical training for the kind of high-stakes problem-solving that Emily would need to master if she hoped to build any kind of meaningful career after release, especially given the additional challenges she would face due to her criminal background and the permanent association of her name with one of America's most notorious crimes. You possess what I can only describe as a CEO's analytical mind, Marcus wrote in one particularly encouraging letter that Emily kept folded in her Bible for years afterward, reading it whenever her motivation flagged or when the enormity of her situation seemed overwhelming and impossible to overcome through individual effort. The challenge you'll face isn't a lack of capability or intelligence. Those qualities are clearly evident in every assignment you complete and every strategic analysis you provide. The real challenge will be convincing a world that has decided you're irredeemable to look beyond your past and recognize your genuine qualifications and potential, contributions to organizations that need precisely the kind of analytical skills you've developed. During her therapy sessions with Raymond, who was now in his 80s and beginning to plan his own retirement from decades of prison work that had defined his professional identity and personal sense of purpose, Emily started articulating her plans for post-release life with increasing clarity and sophistication that impressed even her experienced mentor. Her thinking had evolved far beyond simple dreams of freedom or revenge fantasies against those who had betrayed her. She was developing complex, multi-layered strategies for professional advancement and personal reconstruction that took into account the full reality of her situation without either minimizing the challenges she would face or surrendering to despair about their magnitude. I'm not going to waste time trying to make peace with what I did or seeking public forgiveness. That will never come, she told Raymond during one brutally honest conversation in her 20th year of imprisonment, her voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that comes from years of careful thought and emotional processing rather than impulsive decision-making. That's impossible given the magnitude of my crime and its public notoriety, the media attention, the documentary films, the true crime books. My story has become part of American culture now, and that's a reality I have to accept rather than fight against. Raymond listened to these declarations with mixed emotions playing across his deeply lined features, proud of the growth he had witnessed but also concerned about the potential dangers of Emily's ambitious plans and the psychological risks involved in building her entire future around, proving something to people who had already made up their minds about her character and worthiness of redemption. Revenge can be an extremely dangerous motivation, Emily, even when it's disguised as higher purpose or philosophical principle, he warned with the voice of someone who had seen too many promising rehabilitation efforts derailed by unresolved anger and need for vindication. It has the potential to consume you just as thoroughly as guilt and self-hatred once did, creating a different kind of prison that might be even more destructive than the one you're trying to escape. I've seen too many people poison their second chances by remaining obsessed with evening scores from their past. Emily's response revealed how completely she had evolved. During 2 decades of disciplined self-reconstruction, how thoroughly she had internalized the lessons about personal responsibility and moral complexity that Raymond had spent years trying to teach her through their therapeutic relationship. What I'm planning isn't revenge in any petty or destructive sense, Raymond. It's justice, not the kind imposed by courts and judges through punishment and incarceration, but the kind that emerges naturally when truth becomes visible and people are forced to confront the full complexity of situations they've oversimplified for their own psychological comfort. The final 3 years before Emily's scheduled release were characterized by intensified preparation for reintegration into a society that had fundamentally changed during her quarter-century absence. Technological and social transformations that made her situation even more challenging than it would have been for typical inmates, who had maintained some connection to the outside world through family, visits, and regular communication with friends and relatives who could help bridge the gap between prison life and civilian existence. Emily studied current job market trends obsessively, using the prison's limited internet access and computer resources to identify industries experiencing severe talent shortages where a criminal record might be less prohibitive than in traditional corporate environments that prioritized reputation and social connections over demonstrated ability and measurable results. She discovered that the rapidly expanding technology sector, particularly startup companies focused on data analysis and business consulting, was notoriously less concerned with applicants' personal histories as long as they could demonstrate concrete ability to deliver measurable results under pressure and tight deadlines. August 3, 2050. Emily Carter walked through Danbury Federal Penitentiary's main gates carrying only a small canvas backpack containing her few personal possessions. Simple, civilian clothes that she had ordered through the prison commissary. Educational certificates representing 22 years of academic achievement that few people would ever fully appreciate or understand, and handwritten contact information that Raymond and Professor Chen had carefully compiled for her, transitioned back into a world that had moved forward, without her for 25 years while she existed in suspended animation behind concrete walls and razor wire. The first 6 months of reintegration proved brutally challenging in ways Emily had anticipated but couldn't have fully prepared for despite years of mental rehearsal and strategic planning. Technology had advanced at an exponential pace during her incarceration. Smartphones were now essential for virtually every basic life function. Transportation required navigation of complex mobile applications. Even simple job applications demanded fluency with digital platforms and social media profiles that hadn't existed when she was first imprisoned and certainly hadn't been part of her educational curriculum during her years of self-improvement, the breakthrough that would change. Everything came through Professor Chen's extensive network of former students and industry contacts who shared his belief in second chances and the possibility of human redemption through demonstrated commitment to positive change. Ryan Torres, an idealistic 31-year-old entrepreneur, had founded a small but promising data and analytics startup in Stanford and desperately needed talented personnel he couldn't afford to hire at Silicon Valley compensation levels or with traditional corporate benefits packages. When Emily explained her situation with stark, uncompromising honesty during their initial interview, "I committed a terrible crime 25 years ago, served my complete sentence, and have spent every day since preparing to become genuinely useful to society." Again, Ryan was impressed by her raw authenticity and obvious intellectual capabilities rather than deterred by her criminal background and the permanent stigma it would always carry. Emily attacked her new professional responsibilities with the focused intensity that had characterized her entire prison transformation. Arriving at the office 2 hours before any colleagues and staying 2 hours after everyone else departed. Identifying patterns in complex data sets that others had missed entirely. Presenting innovative solutions to problems the company hadn't even realized existed, until she pointed them out and suggested practical remedies. The final confrontation with Jennifer came exactly as Emily had orchestrated, through years of patient planning and strategic positioning via completely legitimate professional channels that gave her absolute legal authority to examine every aspect of her sister's supposedly charitable foundation. When Emily walked into that Greenwich conference room as Director of Nonprofit Operations Analysis, watching Jennifer's face drain of all color in instant recognition of the sister she had betrayed and presumed destroyed forever, Emily experienced something she hadn't felt in 27 years. The profound satisfaction of perfect strategic execution combined with absolute moral authority. The comprehensive audit that followed revealed years of systematic financial mismanagement and ethical violations that destroyed Jennifer's carefully constructed public reputation just as thoroughly as Jennifer had once orchestrated Emily's complete social annihilation through her calculated testimony and strategic positioning as the innocent victim of her sister's monstrous acts. But victory, Emily discovered through lived experience, proved far more complex and ultimately more satisfying than her revenge fantasies had ever suggested. Justice had finally been served, not through violence or cruelty or any form of active harm, but through the simple revolutionary act of refusing to remain defined by other people's narratives about who she was supposed to be forever, and proving through sustained effort and undeniable results that transformation, redemption, and resurrection were possible even after the most devastating falls from grace that human beings could experience or inflict upon themselves through their own moral failures and psychological blindness.